There are places in the American West where a woman's patience becomes the most quietly remarkable thing in a county, not patience born of weakness, not the resignation of someone who has no other choice, but the particular, deliberate patience of a woman who knows exactly what she wants and has decided with full understanding of the cost to wait for it. In Harrow Creek, Montana, in the autumn of 1889, that woman was Cecily Marsh. She was 28 years old, the only daughter of the town's Presbyterian minister. With dark auburn hair she kept in a loose braid most days and steady brown eyes that had a way of making people feel seen more completely than they were comfortable with. She was quiet without being timid, direct without being unkind, and she had the particular competence of frontier women who learned early that no one was coming to do the hard things for them. Every eligible man in Harrow Creek had at one point or another worked up the nerve to try. There had been Sunday afternoon calls, careful bouquets left at the parsonage door, invitations extended at harvest socials and church picnics. A timber merchant from Ridgecroft had made an offer so formal it included a written proposal of terms. A young deputy from the county seat had ridden 40 minutes each way, 3 Sundays running, before Cecily ended his effort with a kindness so genuine it was somehow worse than a sharp refusal. She turned them all down the same way, warmly, honestly, without spectacle. People had theories because people always do. She was too particular. She was waiting on a man from the city. She had promised herself to someone who had died. None of the theories were right. The truth was simpler and more inconvenient than any of them, and it had a name. The name was Warren Alt, and he was the last man in Harrow Creek who would have guessed it. Warren was 33 and ran the town's only grain mill, which he had rebuilt from its original ruin with his own hands over the course of 2 difficult years after buying it at a low price from a family that had given up and moved east. He was not the wealthiest man in Harrow Creek, not the most polished. He was lean and deliberate, with the kind of face that took some time to read, and hands that were always dusted faintly with grain. He spoke carefully and didn't waste words, which some people mistook for coldness. It was not coldness. It was just the habit of a man who had learned to mean what he said. What Warren Alt was, without question or performance, was trustworthy. He showed up when he said he would. He charged what the work was worth, and not $1 more. When the Hadfield boy lost 2 fingers in a threshing accident, Warren sat with the family through the night and then spent the following week reorganizing his operation so it would never happen again. He never mentioned either thing. He and Cecily had known each other since she arrived in Harrow Creek 6 years ago with her father, who had been called to the struggling congregation at the edge of town. Warren had been one of the men who helped carry furniture into the parsonage. She had handed him a cup of water and said straightforwardly, "You've been working harder than anyone, and you haven't asked for anything. That either makes you a good man or a stubborn one." He had considered this and said, "Probably both." And she had smiled in a way that he didn't think about again for 2 years, which was its own kind of answer. They were friends in the easy, unexamined way of people whose paths cross often enough that the friendship stops being a choice and becomes simply a fact. He came to her father's Sunday sermons, not because he was particularly devout, but because the minister was a good and thoughtful man, and the congregation needed bodies to keep its doors open. She stopped by the mill sometimes when she was walking, and they would talk about the town, the weather, the books she lent him from her father's small library, which he always returned with more pages dog-eared than she expected. He looked at Cecily Marsh the way you look at the fixed stars, present, reliable, orienting, and somehow, in the way of people who take necessary things for granted, he never thought about what it would mean if they weren't there. On a Wednesday morning in October, Cecily came by the mill to return a book and found Warren outside, doing the kind of maintenance work that never fully ends, checking the wheel mechanism, tightening what needed tightening, the quiet industry of a man who keeps things running before they break. He looked up when she approached, and his face did the thing it did sometimes, a brief settling, like something coming into focus that he was never aware of. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she said, and handed him the book. He looked at the spine. "Already? It's a short one. What did you think?" "I think the man waited too long and knew it," she said. "And I think the author was too kind to him about it." Warren considered this. "I'll read it slower then," she smiled. You do that, she walked on. Behind her, coming out of the feed store, was Aldous Crane, a cattleman from the Upper Valley who had been quietly unsuccessful with Cecily for the better part of a year and was philosophical enough about it by now to simply observe. He watched Warren watch her go. You know, Aldous said, for a man who built a mill from nothing, you have a remarkable inability to see what's been standing next to you for 6 years. Warren looked at him with genuine puzzlement. What are you talking about? Aldous looked up at the sky and said nothing for a moment. Then, nothing. Enjoy your book. But there was something Aldous knew that Warren didn't. Something that had changed the particular arithmetic of the situation. A man named Clyde Prescott had arrived in Harrow Creek 3 weeks ago. Prescott was 40, a land attorney from Helena with money and bearing, and the easy confidence of someone accustomed to getting what he decided to want. He had come on business related to a disputed property claim, but he had extended his stay twice, and he had been attending Sunday services with a consistency that had nothing to do with religious conviction. He was, anyone paying attention could see, paying attention to Cecily Marsh. The Harvest Social was held in the Grange Hall on a Friday evening in late October, lit by lanterns and loud with fiddle music and the particular noise of a small community making the most of an excuse to gather before winter closed in. Cecily came because her father needed to be there and because Margaret Fowler, who organized these things, had asked her specifically to help with the food tables and had been so kind about it that refusing would have felt cruel. She wore a dark green dress that had been her mother's, taken in and shortened. She helped with the tables. She danced twice with men who asked politely and held them to the agreed number of dances with a friendliness that left no room for interpretation. Clyde Prescott arrived 40 minutes in. He was the best-dressed man in the room and knew it without displaying it, which was its own form of display. He asked her to dance, and she accepted because her father's position required her to be gracious, and because she was gracious by nature anyway. Prescott was a good dancer. He was also, she noticed, a very deliberate conversationalist, asking questions and filing the answers with the methodical interest of a man building a case. He was not unpleasant. He was simply, in some important way, not Warren. Across the room, Warren arrived late, still in his work clothes because he had lost track of time, which was a thing that happened with him. He accepted a cup of something warm from the refreshment table and leaned against the wall and watched the room in the comfortable, unhurried way of a man who is happy observing. He saw Cecily dancing with Prescott. He thought, vaguely, that she looked like she was being polite. She caught his eye over Prescott's shoulder and gave him a look, quick, dry, and specific, the kind that said, "You owe me for this." He almost smiled. Then Harvey Tillman appeared at his elbow, wanting to talk about grain prices, and Warren turned his attention to Harvey, and when he looked back, Cecily had turned her face away. She had seen him almost smile. She had seen him look at Harvey Tillman. She looked back at Prescott, who was watching her with deliberate, unhurried attention. And she felt for the first time in a long time the cold arithmetic of it. She was 28. Prescott was accomplished and attentive and available and interested. Warren was 33 and had never, in 6 years, once given her a reason to think he saw her as anything more than the minister's daughter who lent him books. Some forms of patience, she understood, have a natural expiration. 3 days after the social, Cecily's father, Reverend Arthur Marsh, was sitting on the parsonage porch in the late afternoon when she came back from her walk. He had a cup of coffee and the expression he wore when he had something to say and was deciding how to say it. "Clyde Prescott came by this morning," he said. Cecily sat down on the porch step. "He didn't come to talk about his soul, I take it." "He came to talk about you," Arthur said. "He asked how long we intended to stay in Harrow Creek. Whether you had any particular," he said, "attachments. That would make you reluctant to relocate to Helena." Cecily was quiet. "He's a serious man," Arthur said. "He has good standing. I don't say that to push you toward anything. I say it because I think he's going to make a formal inquiry within the next few weeks, and I thought you should know before it became a thing you had no warning about." Cecily looked at the mountains at the edge of the valley. The peaks had snow now, blue-white in the afternoon light. "Papa," she said, "do you know why I've turned down every man who's asked?" "I have a suspicion," he said carefully. "Warren Alt." Arthur nodded once. slowly in the way of a man who has held his tongue on a subject for a considerable amount of time. "He doesn't see it," Cecily said. "I've waited. I've been patient because I thought eventually." She stopped, started again. "He looks at me like I'm part of the landscape, like I'm just always going to be there." "Maybe you've been too patient," Arthur said gently. "Maybe he needs to understand that you won't just always be there." Cecily looked at the mountains. "Prescott is a good man," she said. "He's attentive and he's accomplished and he's made it clear what he wants." She paused. "If Warren can't," she stopped again. "How long will you wait?" Arthur asked. She was quiet for a moment. "Not past this winter," she said, and there was something different in her voice when she said it. Not bitterness, not defeat, just the sound of a decision that has finally fully been made. It was Aldous Crane who told Warren, because someone had to, and Aldous had decided over the course of several weeks that if he waited for the universe to arrange this on its own, he would be waiting past the point of relevance. He found Warren at the mill on a Monday morning and told him plainly Clyde Prescott was going to make a formal inquiry to Reverend Marsh about Cecily. Probably within the month. His clerk had said so. His clerk had heard it from Prescott's own associate, who had no reason to fabricate it. Warren kept working while Aldous talked. He was checking the tension on the drive belt, which required a particular kind of attention. He did not look up immediately. "Where did you hear this?" he said finally. Aldous told him. Warren set down his tools. He straightened up slowly. "I don't understand what that has to do with me," he said, and he meant it, which was the part that made Aldous want to sit down from the weight of it. "Warren," Aldous said with the particular patience of a man delivering news to someone who should already know it, "Cecily Marsh has said no to every man in this county for 6 years. You understand there's a reason for that. You understand that the reason has been coming to your mill to return books for 6 years. You understand that you are, at this exact moment, the only person in Harrow Creek who doesn't see it." The mill was quiet. Somewhere outside, a horse shifted against its post. Warren looked at Aldous for a long time. "She'd never." He started. "She has," Aldous said, simply and without drama. "She has been, for years, and Prescott doesn't know that. And if you wait much longer, she's going to have to make a different kind of decision." "Because she's not going to wait forever, Warren." She told her father as much. He picked up his hat from the nail by the door. "I've said what I came to say." Warren stood in the mill after he left. The drive belt turned slowly. Grain dust hung in the light from the high windows. He held the same wrench he'd been using and did not move for a long time. 6 years. He thought about the book she'd returned last week. The man waited too long and knew it, and the author was too kind to him about it. He thought about every time she'd come by, and he'd handed the conversation back to normal before it could become something else, without ever understanding that was what he was doing. He set the wrench down, very carefully, like a man setting down something he'd been gripping so long he'd forgotten it was in his hand. Prescott. Within the month, he was at the parsonage the next morning. She was in the kitchen garden when he came around the side of the house, doing the kind of practical autumn work that gardens require before winter, clearing dead growth, turning the soil at the bed's edges. She looked up when she heard the gate and then went very still, with the specific stillness of someone who has rehearsed a version of this moment without ever expecting it to actually arrive. "Warren," she said. "Cecily," he said. He stopped at the garden gate and held his hat in both hands, which was a thing she had never seen him do. Warren Alt was not a man who stood around holding his hat. "I heard about Prescott," he said. She waited. "I know I have no standing to say anything about it," he said. "I know that's entirely of my own making. I've had 6 years and I didn't." He stopped, tried again. "I convinced myself it wasn't possible, that someone like you wouldn't." He stopped again. "Warren," she said. "Let me finish," he said, "because I've been working up to this since yesterday morning and I need to get it out." She waited. He looked at her directly. "I don't want you to decide anything about Prescott without knowing that I love you. I think I have for years without understanding what I was looking at. And I know that might not be enough after all this time. I know I don't have the right to ask anything. But I couldn't let you think." He paused. "I couldn't let you think that no one here saw you, because I see you. Cecily, I was just too slow and too stupid to say it." The garden was quiet. A crow called somewhere in the cottonwoods by the fence. She looked at him for a long moment, this man who had always been there, who had always been exactly what she knew him to be, who had somehow needed 6 years and the threat of losing her to understand what the rest of Harrow Creek had understood for considerably longer. Then she set down her trowel, and she crossed the garden to the gate where he was standing, and she said, quietly enough that only he could hear, "Warren, I've been standing here waiting for you to see it. I've been turning men down for 6 years because none of them were you, and I'm not angry that it took you this long." A pause. "But I need you to understand that I can't keep being part of the landscape." He looked at her. "I don't want you to be part of the landscape," he said. "I want you to be the whole view." She held his gaze for a moment. Then, for the first time in 6 years, she let herself stop being patient. "Then stop standing outside the gate," she said. "Before we go further, I want to know where you're listening from today. Drop your city and state in the comments. It means more than you know to understand where these stories are reaching." Now, back to Harrow Creek, because Warren Alt still has some things to attend to. He went to see Reverend Arthur Marsh the following morning. He wore his good shirt and had combed his hair with evident intention, and he had the expression of a man who has made a decision and is finished reconsidering it. Arthur was in his study when Warren knocked. He looked at Warren, the shirt, the hair, the set of his jaw, and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "I wondered when you'd get here." Warren said, "I should have gotten here a long time ago." Arthur looked at him steadily. "Yes," he said, "you should have." A pause. "What are you asking me?" "Permission to call on Cecily," Warren said, "properly, formally, starting now." Arthur picked up his coffee cup and looked into it. "You have it," he said. Cecily was at the front of the church sorting hymnals when Warren came through the door. She looked up and went still in that particular way again, and then something in her shoulders came down, like a breath she'd been holding longer than she'd known. "You talked to my father," she said. "I did." He said, "Yes, he did." Warren stopped in the aisle. "I didn't bring flowers. I know I should have brought flowers." "You should have," she said. "I'll bring them tomorrow. Is that a promise?" "Yes." She looked at him for a moment. "Warren," she said, "do you understand what you're doing?" "Starting over," he said, "with the sense to know what I have this time." She considered him, this man who had taken 6 years to arrive, who was now standing in her father's church in his good shirt, hat in hand, with the earnest directness of someone who had stopped hedging. She had waited a long time for this version of him. She decided he was worth the wait. "The flowers had better be nice," she said. They were. He brought them the next day, and every Tuesday after that, which became a quiet institution in Harrow Creek. Warren Alt walking down Main Street on Tuesday mornings with something picked or purchased, which the town tracked with the investment of a community that has been watching a story develop for years and feels, with some justification, that it has earned a stake in the outcome. He came to Sunday supper at the parsonage and talked with Arthur about theology and grain yields in the coming winter, and Cecily sat across the table and they were easy with each other in the way they had always been, except now they were not pretending it was only neighborly. On a Sunday afternoon in November, they walked to the eastern ridge above town, where you could see the whole valley laid out, pale gold in the late autumn light, the mountains behind them already deep in their winter white. "Why me?" he asked, and he genuinely didn't know, which was one of the things she had always liked about him. "Because you never needed to impress me," she said. "Every other man who came around was showing me something. His prospects, his position, his plans. You just showed up the same every time. Honest." She looked out over the valley. "I always knew exactly who you were. That's rarer than people know." He was quiet for a moment. "Prescott is a good man," he said. "He is. You could have Warren." She turned to look at him. "I waited for you, not because I had no other choice, because you were the right one. Don't make me explain that twice." He looked at her. At this woman who had held something quietly for 6 years and offered it to him without conditions, without drama, without ever letting him know what it cost her, and he felt the full weight of what had almost happened. What another month of his own obliviousness would have cost them both. He was not going to be oblivious again. He asked her in December on the evening after the church Christmas social on the parsonage steps in the cold Montana air. He had a ring in his coat pocket, a simple thing, gold with a small carved setting, that had been his mother's and that he had cleaned carefully and carried for 3 weeks, waiting for a moment that felt honest rather than staged. "Cecily," he said, "I need to say something plainly because I've been unclear for too long and you've been patient past what you should have had to be." She looked at him. Her breath made small clouds in the cold air. "I love you," he said. "I have for a long time, which I know is not a point in my favor since I spent most of that time not knowing it. But I know it now the way I know things I'm most certain of, and I would like very much for you to be my wife." He paused. "If you'll take a man who was slow and is trying to spend the rest of his time making up for it." Cecily looked at him for a long moment in the cold dark. "Warren Alt," she said, "that may be the least romantic proposal in the history of Montana. I know. You could have said almost any of that more poetically." "I know that too." She looked at him. The cold wind moved down the street and neither of them looked away. "Yes," she said, simply, clearly. After 6 years of patience, the word that had been waiting. He put the ring on her finger there on the parsonage steps, and she looked at it in the lamplight from the door, and her face had the expression of someone recognizing something. Not new, but finally, fully, theirs. They were married in February, which is not a traditional time for weddings in Montana, but Cecily and Warren were not particularly traditional people, and had both already waited longer than was strictly reasonable. The church was full regardless. Half of Harrow Creek attended with the satisfaction of people who had watched something take 6 years to become what it obviously always was. Aldous Crane, in the second pew, was observed to be suspiciously emotional for a man who maintained he had no interest in romantic matters. Cecily wore a simple white dress and walked toward Warren with the unhurried certainty of a woman who is arriving exactly where she intended. He stood at the front of the church and watched her come and understood, with a clarity that arrived somewhere in his chest rather than his head, how close it had come to not happening. How Prescott's inquiry had been 2 weeks away. How another month of his own blindness might have decided everything. He made himself remember that. They said their vows simply and meant every word. The years that followed were steady ones, good in the way of things built from honest materials. The mill grew under Cecily's eye for the numbers. She discovered in the first month that Warren had been undervaluing his labor by a significant margin and corrected it without asking permission, which he accepted without argument. He had learned quickly that on matters of practical sense, Cecily was simply right. Their daughter came in the second year. They named her June for the month that had always been Warren's favorite. The one when the valley went from brown to green almost overnight, like the world making up its mind. June had her mother's steady eyes and her father's unhurried way of moving, and she observed everything before she spoke, which the people of Harrow Creek found familiar. Their son arrived in the 4th year. They named him Arthur for Cecily's father, who was still alive and still serving the congregation, and who cried at the naming and then denied doing so. On a summer evening in their 7th year, Warren came home from the mill to find Cecily in the kitchen garden, the same one where everything had started, doing the kind of evening work that keeps a garden through the summer. Watering, checking, the quiet rounds of someone who tends things carefully. The light was gold the way Montana light gets in July, long and warm, catching in her hair. He stopped at the gate. She noticed him, turned. "You're standing there again," she said. "I know, you used to walk right past. I used to not understand what I was looking at," he said. "I've improved." She smiled, his smile, the one she'd kept for him for years. He came through the gate and crossed the yard and took the watering can from her hands and set it down and held her in the evening light, while June and Arthur made noise somewhere inside the house that had the particular energy of children who have found something they shouldn't. Warren pressed his lips to the top of Cecily's head and thought about Aldous Crane in the mill doorway, saying, "She's not going to wait forever." About the wrench he'd set down carefully. About how different it all might have been. He was grateful in the way you are only grateful when you understand what it cost. "I see you," he said. She didn't ask what he meant. She had always known what he meant. She'd just been waiting for him to figure out how to say it. Years later, June was old enough to ask. She was helping her mother in the kitchen, learning the bread that had become a household institution, and the question arrived the way questions do between mothers and daughters, sideways, in the middle of something else. "How did you know Papa was the one?" June said. Before he knew, Cecily worked the dough for a moment without answering. He never needed to be anything different around me, she said finally. Every other man who came around was performing something. Your father just showed up, same every time. She paused. That's rarer than people think. June considered this, but you almost didn't wait. Because of Mr. Prescott. Yes, Cecily said honestly. Almost. She handed June the bread tin. That's the part I want you to remember. Not the happy ending, the almost. She looked at her daughter. Know what you want, don't shrink yourself for anyone, and if the person you're waiting for is slow, she paused, give him time, but not forever. At some point, you say the true thing. You give him the chance to show up. What if he doesn't? June asked. Cecily was quiet for a moment. Then you know. And you move forward. She covered her daughter's hands with hers. But June, in my experience, and here she smiled, the real one, the one that had waited 6 years to be understood, when you say the true thing to the right person, they show up. Cecily did not wait passively. She never had. She showed up as herself every day. No performance, no shrinking, no strategy beyond the simple consistency of being exactly who she was. And when the time came, when she understood that patience without honesty is just hope with nowhere to go, she said the true thing on a cold October morning in a kitchen garden and walked away without waiting for an answer. That is not a small thing to do. It is, in fact, the whole point. Warren is not a villain in this story. He is something more recognizable. A man who convinced himself that what he wanted most was beyond his reach, and so never reached, until the morning a friend told him plainly that the door he'd been standing outside of was about to close. Sometimes we need that. Sometimes the thing that finally moves us is not the presence of love, we had that already, but the sudden, undeniable understanding that love is not required to wait indefinitely. They chose each other at the last reasonable moment, but they chose deliberately. And they chose well, and it held. That is the part worth carrying with you. Thank you for listening today, wherever you are. I'm glad you were here. Until next time, keep listening.